Thank you. Before I go on to the next item of business, I have to say there is no time in hand now whatsoever. So take interventions, you'll have to absorb them, I'm afraid, into your time allocation. The next item of business is a debate on motion 22955 in the name of Michael Russell on legislative consent to the Internal Market Bill. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? I call Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, today we are faced with no ordinary decision about whether to give or withhold approval to a Westminster bill. For this debate is actually about a decision regarding the value of this Parliament and the people we serve, and whether we are prepared to stand up for them or allow a UK government to, and I quote, fundamentally overwrite and undermine a material part of the system of devolution that has operated in the UK for more than 2 decades. That devolution settlement came into being because of a decisive vote by the people of Scotland in 1997. Labour, and I'm happy to acknowledge Scotland's debt to the party and to Donald Dewar, legislated for that devolution referendum, and my party campaigned with them, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, in favour of establishing this institution. We did not agree on the process that led to that vote, but when the choice came, the SNP backed what the people of Scotland wanted, and now when that choice is again in front of us, we do so again. I was part of that campaign, working with many, including Alec Rowley, to persuade our fellow citizens to mark their ballot papers with a double yes. And I'm in the same company again, though I do not relish the circumstances. I'm sure that Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens will repeat today their commitment to what the people wanted then, as will we. Our vote will follow our voice. But alas, the Tories, no doubt, will again be true to their stance then, a stance taken directly against the will of the Scottish people. They were against empowering their fellow citizens then, and they're still against doing that 23 years later. Leopards don't change their spots. And having been rejected then, they've gone on being rejected, most recently in last December's Westminster election. Yet despite that, they are still seeking to take a wrecking ball to Scotland's Parliament and Scotland's democracy. That wasn't in their manifesto, but it was clearly in their minds then and always has been. I give way.
Liz Smith.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary taking an intervention. Does he accept that the Internal Market Bill is very much about protecting jobs and investment in Scotland, and that is absolutely critical?
But the answer is no, I do not. And indeed, the fact-checking service proves that that is not the case. But as I said, wrecking Scotland's Parliament was not put to the Scottish people by the Conservatives, but it is what they intended to do, and it is what they are trying to do. Presiding Officer, the memorandum before us today makes clear that if the bill becomes law, then the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament and the executive competence of Scottish ministers as they've been understood since 1998 would in many cases cease to exist. But as well as an assault on devolution, this bill is a recipe for regulatory incoherence and a race to the bottom. It is also a breach of international law. Presiding Officer, the fundamental principle of the Ministerial Code is that ministers must not knowingly break the law. That in itself is an incontrovertible reason why Scottish ministers cannot recommend legislative consent for the bill, but I would also argue that no member of a Scottish Parliament elected to serve the people of Scotland could ever recommend consent to such a bill. Members will be familiar with the main provisions, but let me go through them. The bill contains sweeping new blanket mutual recognition and non-discrimination provisions at parts 1 and 2, and these would require Scotland to accept lower standards relating to food, as pointed out by Food Standards Scotland, to the environment, as pointed out by Environment Link, and building materials, as pointed out by the Royal Incorporation of Architects, and those regardless of the views of the Parliament or the wishes of the people of Scotland, and the scope of those powers can be unilaterally changed by UK ministers and only by UK ministers. There are new measures for mutual recognition of professional qualifications that cause grave concern to bodies such as the General Teaching Council. There's a new oversight body tasked with second-guessing the policy choices of this Parliament, including in things like in the public services like the health service or public water supplies. Measures at Part 5 of the bill break international law and betray a cynical disregard for Northern Ireland, which has already alienated many, including the EU. There are sweeping new spending powers in Part 6 that threaten the devolved Scottish budget and transfer decision-making over areas of devolved spending from the Scottish to the UK government. State aid will be reserved, which could affect, for example, agricultural subsidy, and the whole Act would be placed permanently beyond the powers of this Parliament to mitigate or ameliorate. For those reasons, the bill is wholly unacceptable and should be rejected. The deceit practised by the UK government with regard to this bill is now a matter of public record, thanks to yesterday's leak of documents that show the truth about how it was deliberately withheld from the devolved governments. But there have been other deceits too. Firstly, the ridiculous assertion that the bill represents a power surge. The opposite is true, as the explanatory notes make clear. In fact, there will be a new blanket constraint on the exercise of the Parliament's powers, and the scope of the constraints can be adjusted at any time at the discretion of UK ministers, regardless of other views. Secondly, there are the repeated assurances that the bill will not lead to a race to the bottom in standards. But the UK currently enjoys high standards by virtue of EU laws still applying during the transition period. Under the bill, should Scotland wish to maintain those standards, we'll be forced still to recognise lower standards set elsewhere in the UK. And the UK government has blocked, no, I will not. UK government has blocked every, because I'm just coming to one of your key assertions. The UK government has blocked every proposed move to provide legal guarantees that high environmental, animal welfare and food safety standards would prevail. Thirdly, let me rebut the claim that this bill is necessary merely in order to replace at UK level the system of UK market rules. In fact, the bill introduces a system of unqualified powers for UK ministers to effectively impose rules on the whole of the UK, even in devolved areas, which is the very opposite of the principle of co-decision and agreement between sovereign member states that lies at the heart of the EU rules. EU single market rules also recognise policy objectives alongside market considerations, and the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality are crucial aspects of them. And finally, let me talk about jobs. Mr Lockhart's amendment talks about the 550,000 jobs being protected by this bill. Nonsense. In fact, nonsense on stilts, as exposed in the Ferret fact-checking website last night. Presiding officer, they don't like the truth. Presiding officer, at the end of December, the UK and Scotland will leave the Brexit transition period. The transition is ending because of the astonishing and reckless decision of Boris Johnson to refuse an extension that was on offer despite the fact of a global pandemic and a deep economic recession. Yet even at this late stage, the possibility of leaving in the worst possible way with no deal remains. And even if there is a deal, it will be a low deal, vastly inferior to what we experience now and hugely disadvantageous to business and disruptive to everyday life. So, presiding officer, the real jobs threat comes not from the devolved administrations, but from the Brexiteer ultras who have captured the Conservative Party, and those in this chamber who have meekly accepted their writ, no doubt because it saves their own jobs. The way to avoid all this damage is not only clear, but to hand. We can do so by returning to the voluntary common frameworks process devised by the devolved governments in the UK, which, despite our differences over EU exit, has been able to make progress over the last few years. Frameworks are based on principles of equal negotiation and agreement. If there are any missing areas, as claimed by Michael Gove very late in the day, we commit ourselves to closing those gaps. We're also willing to act as if all the frameworks were already in force whilst they're being finalised. And I think the same commitment is being made in Wales. So if the UK does that, we could move on from this present impasse and the deepening crisis. Presiding officer, this bill is not only unacceptable to the devolved governments, it is also unacceptable to a wide range of organisations and individuals across Scottish society who are deeply worried. Now, of course, there are differing views of Scotland's ultimate constitutional destination across this chamber. But regardless of those views, we can come together today. We can say on behalf of the people of Scotland that we do not consent to this bill. We can stand up against this Tory power grab and urge the UK government to change course. And therefore, presiding officer, I move that the Parliament agrees not to consent to the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill, as it reduces and constrains the competence of this Scottish Parliament and breaches international law.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Bruce Crawford to open on behalf of the committee. Convener, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I could begin by, first of all, thanking all of the committee members for their very hard work and commitment in completing so many reports this week, and also to our clerks for the significant help and advice they provided in our work. It's with some regret that I speak on behalf of only 8 members of the committee this afternoon. As members know, I've always sought as a convener to try where possible to reach a consensus on committee reports, and in the main, we've managed to do so. However, there's a clear division of views between the majority of the committee and our Conservative Party colleagues on the UK Internal Market Bill. This is disappointing, given that the other 8 members on the committee have agreed that the bill undermines the whole basis of devolution. Our view is that the devolution cannot work if the Westminster Government simply imposes its view on how the UK constitutional arrangements should evolve following Brexit. Unfortunately, the bill aims to do just that, both in relation to its substance and the way it's been handled. Our most significant concern is with the market access principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. Mutual recognition in particular is potentially much more far-reaching than the equivalent EU principle. This is primarily for 3 reasons. First, the list of exclusions on public interest grounds from the application of the principle are much narrower. And second, UK ministers have the power to amend that list without any requirement to seek consent or consult with the devolved governments. Third, the asymmetrical structure of the UK internal market. Given the relative size of the English economy and population, inevitably it will be market forces which determine regulatory standards. Why would any devolved government then want to potentially put their own economies at a competitive disadvantage by seeking higher regulatory standards, which can then be undermined by imports from other parts of the UK which don't need to meet those same standards? This means in reality that regulatory standards agreed by the UK Parliament would effectively be imposed on the devolved nations. The committee heard that this approach is significantly different from the approach taken in the EU and other internal markets. Dr. Emily Lydgate from the University of Sussex told us, and I quote, "The core of any approach to an internal market that is as integrated as the UK's has to be harmonised rules that have a strong consultative process underlying them. The rules cannot simply be set by one of the countries." Presiding Officer, the committee's view is that it's unacceptable that the UK government should seek to effectively impose new reservations on the devolved competencies through this bill. This is not myth-making, as the Duchy of Lancaster would have it, but a clear consequence of the proposed market access principle in the context of the relative size of England's population and economy. The UK government has argued that the agreement of common frameworks means that the market access principles will only apply in a limited number of policy areas. But it's not clear how common frameworks can address the threat to devolution in this bill. In areas where the devolved governments may wish to have higher standards than the minimum standards agreed in frameworks, these will be potentially rendered ineffective by the market access principles. Consequently, there needs to be far greater clarity about how both statutory and non-statutory frameworks would interact with the market access principles. The committee also considered the provisions in the bill to reserve state aid. The committee agrees with the Scottish Government and Welsh Government that state aid is a devolved matter. Any future legislation on subsidy control should be agreed between all of the 4 governments and legislators across the UK through the Common Frameworks process. The committee therefore recommends that the reservation of subsidy control is unnecessary and should be removed from the bill. Part 6 of the bill will provide the UK government with a single, comprehensive statutory power to provide financial assistance across a range of policy areas throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. The committee's view is that it's regrettable that Part 6 has not been subject to any public or parliamentary consultation. It's also regrettable that the views of the devolved governments were not sought. We reiterate the findings of our report on structural funds post-Brexit. In particular, that any UK-wide replacement of EU structural funding should replicate some of the aspects of the current structural funds approach. We consider the decision-taking powers that the Scottish Government currently exercises under structural funds should not be reduced under any future UK approach. Second Officer, the committee previously recommended that there is an onus on all four governments and legislators across the UK to work constructively together to seek a solution to the complex and challenging issues arising from leaving the EU internal market. The committee recommended that this must be achieved through mutual trust and respect for the UK's existing constitutional arrangement. The committee concludes that it is highly regrettable that in relation to the internal market bill, this has not happened. The committee is dismayed that the UK government has instead adopted a hierarchical approach through which its default position is to impose new limitations on devolution which go way beyond the previous limitations of EU membership. The committee's view is that devolution cannot work on the basis of a Westminster government imposing its view on how the UK constitutional arrangements should evolve following Brexit. The committee therefore recommends that the Parliament does not consent to the UK internal market bill. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Crawford. I now call on Dean Lockhart to speak to move Amendment 22955.1 on behalf of the Conservatives. Mr Lockhart.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. There's been a lot of noise surrounding the UK internal market proposals, but surely the priority, when further restrictions have just been announced on economic activity, must be to protect the 550,000 jobs and livelihoods and the 60% of trade that depend on barrier-free access to the UK internal market. That's certainly the view of key stakeholders, such as the CBI and the NFUS, who have given evidence the internal market is extremely important, more important than the EU market and the rest of the world put together. And, President Officer, that's also our priority. On the other side of this debate, I do recognise there are legitimate questions over how these proposals might work in practice, but too much focus has been on constitutional scaremongering and on hypothetical concerns. Take, for example, paragraph 13 of the LCM, which claims that the bill will result in declining standards, what the Cabinet Secretary referred to as the race to the bottom, a claim utterly devoid of any factual evidence, because the inconvenient truth for the SNP is that the UK government has introduced higher domestic standards than the EU across a vast range of areas. Just weeks ago, the first major, let me make progress, just weeks ago, in the first major free trade agreement signed following Brexit, the economic partnership with Japan, far from lowering standards, this deal goes way beyond the scope of the EU-Japan free trade agreement and has increased the number of protected geographical indications for Scottish produce, meaning that Scottish salmon, cheese, wool and beef will now have much higher levels of protection in the Japanese market. And in relation to the SNP's poster child for lowering standards, the proposed free trade agreement with the US, when I challenged Ivan McKee at committee to give real examples of his concerns about these lower standards, his response was, and I quote, "All concerns are hypothetical." So there we have it, Presiding Officer. A long history, as well as very recent examples of high standards being adopted by the UK government, in direct contrast and in contradiction to the hypotheticals we have heard from the other side. The memorandum goes on to claim that the bill will undermine the powers of this Parliament, when quite the opposite is true. At the end of the transition period, this Parliament will enjoy more than 100 new additional powers coming from the EU, making it more powerful than ever. My colleague just said it's a power surge. Absolutely. But as we all know, the SNP wants to surrender every single one of these powers back to the EU in what would be the biggest power surrender this Parliament has ever seen. Presiding Officer, the motion from the Scottish Government today states that the bill will reduce and constrain the competence of this Parliament. Again, completely untrue, because the agreed approach of all four nations is that the mutually agreed common frameworks will regulate the vast majority of the additional powers coming back from the EU. Let me make this point, it's important. And these frameworks will deliver agreed standards as well as dynamic divergence in areas where devolved administrations want to take a different approach. And we support all of those objectives. But there still has to be a mechanism in place to deal with residual elements of trade which will sit outside of those agreed common frameworks. And that's where this bill comes into play. Witnesses, I will in a second, witnesses such as Professor Keating have recognised the need for such a fallback mechanism. He gave the following evidence. The common frameworks will cover most issues, but if something arises that is not covered by the frameworks, there should be a mechanism for dealing with that. And that's the fundamental point, Presiding Officer, that the Internal Market Bill will only apply as a default mechanism to a residual element of trade that falls outside agreed common frameworks. On that basis, to say that this bill will cripple the Scottish Parliament and its devolved competence, as the First Minister has repeatedly said, is wholly misleading. Take, for example, minimum unit pricing for alcohol. Again, a good example used by the SNP. A divergent approach by this Parliament will be allowed in the future, meaning that alcohol produced elsewhere in the UK can only be sold in Scotland if it complies with minimum pricing in Scotland. Contrast that with the position under EU law, where the Scottish Government had to defend this divergent approach through the courts. Presiding Officer, in his opening remarks, the Cabinet Secretary talked about the United Kingdom no longer being a partnership of equals. But the real test of any partnership is how a partner reacts during a crisis. And we have seen the strength of the UK partnership delivering for Scotland during this time of crisis. £16 billion of additional support as part of the UK Government's COVID response, the UK furlough scheme saving over 900,000 jobs in Scotland, and this bill delivering even more investment to Scotland. But let me ask the Cabinet Secretary, what has his contribution been during this period of crisis? Spending time and money on an unwanted second referendum, walking away from negotiations on the internal market and interfering with the Brexit negotiations. So when the Cabinet Secretary questions this partnership of equals, he is the one trying to undermine the partnership. Finally, Presiding Officer,
winding up.
The Scottish motion today refers to a breach of international law, and perhaps that's what the member wanted to intervene on. It refers to a breach of international law. On this very issue, let me quote what Mr Russell told the committee last week. And I quote directly, "There is nothing unlawful about the House of Commons preparing a bill. It should never have come to the House, but that is not the same as it being illegal." For once, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary.
And you must conclude there.
I'm concluding, Presiding Officer, by emphasising the vital importance of this Parliament protecting jobs and livelihoods during this crisis, and that's why we will be voting for the legislative consent motion at decision time.
Thank you. I now call Alec Rowley to open for Labour. Mr Rowley, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening this debate for Labour today, I want to make clear that we will not give consent to the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill. And let me be clear, we will not give support to any measures that reduce and constrain the competence of the Scottish Parliament. As a political party, Labour is committed to devolution. And for the avoidance of doubt, this bill is a full-on attack on the existing devolution settlement. Devolution has worked for Scotland, and with such economic uncertainty as we face right now, it is further devolution that is required to build back a better Scotland. However, instead of taking the best course of action to protect the UK internal market through the collaboration and cooperation of all nations, we have a take-it-or-leave-it approach from Boris Johnson and his Tory chums. And make no mistake, those Tory chums, including the Scottish Tories sitting in this chamber today, will put Johnson and his interests before the interests of the people of Scotland. So to all those worried about the future of Scotland, I say the greatest threat to the future of Scotland, its economy and its relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and all those Scottish Tories that have lined up behind him blind loyalty. And that is why I say the Tory party want to detract from the real issues in this bill by claiming the argument is about independence. It is nothing to do with independence, but everything to do with the UK Government removing powers from the Scottish Parliament and ultimately from the Scottish people. And then, OK, we've got time.
Patrick Harvie.
Grateful to the member for giving way. Surely he agrees, as I do, with Scotland's trade union movement, who said that if the UK Government proceed with this bill against the wishes of the Scottish Parliament, it makes the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable.
Alec Rowley.
It certainly demonstrates that the greatest threat to the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and his clapping Tories who sit behind him. And then, as an added arrogance, this bill breaches international law, a fact that was readily admitted by the Northern Ireland Secretary in the House of Commons, and the bill is now under legal proceedings from the EU due to that breach. Frankly, this whole thing is a disgrace and will have massive repercussions for the UK's international reputation, which has already been suffering over the last few years of this Conservative government and its failures. However, presiding officer, it is not just that the Internal Market Bill breaks international law or that it drives a coach and horses through devolution. It paves the way, in my view, for private companies and multinational companies to force their way into key public services in Scotland. This bill will lead to a race to the bottom in so many areas of our daily life. The overwhelming evidence from across the world is that in this day and age, we must have more regulation, not less. The idea that everything should be left to the market is not only an outdated idea, it is a dangerous idea whose time has come and gone. So it seems incredible to be ploughing on regardless with this bill and with the Tory Brexit plan. We have supported the Scottish Government to make the case for a Brexit extension, which is absolutely necessary at this time. Interest rates are at rock bottom and the Chancellor of the Exchequer has never borrowed so much, with public debt now more than 100% of the size of our economy. This on top of massive increases in unemployment to COVID and worrying forecasts for further unemployment to come. The pandemic has wrecked our economy, but the economic cost of a no-deal Brexit could be 2 or 3 times as bad as the impact of COVID, according to the London School of Economics. Surely anyone looking at this, presiding officer, would say it's absurd to continue down this path and that we need to think again. That would be anyone but Johnson and Johnson's Tories. I say, think again.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. And I call on Patrick Harvie to the Green Party. 4 minutes, Mr Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an extraordinary process leading to an extraordinary bill which poses an extraordinary threat to us all. The process cut right through the discussion of common frameworks and began with a consultation, a short consultation which could not have been more perfectly timed to coincide with the parliamentary recesses in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It involved a refusal of the Secretary of State responsible for the bill to come and give evidence. It included no draft bill for consultation, and it includes a clear threat to legislate without consent of this Parliament. As far as I understand, the Scottish and Welsh governments were still asking to see the bill during a meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee when a photo of the press release announcing its publication was leaked on Twitter. This could not be more shambolic. But the substance of the bill poses an extraordinary threat as well. The direct assault on this Parliament's democracy, this democratic authority, comes from the political party which opposed the creation of this Parliament in the first place. This is not an insurance policy, it's a wrecking ball. Where mutual respect genuinely exists between the jurisdictions, cooperation is possible, even when political parties with very different politics are in power. The last 20 years shows us that. But this shocking power grab is what makes cooperation impossible. There is no incentive at all for the UK government to negotiate or compromise if it has already taken the decision to ignore and overrule Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and even international law. That's why I'm pleased to say that over 6,000 people have signed up to support the Scottish Green Party's campaign against this bill. But beyond the substance of the bill and the extraordinary process, there is an extraordinary threat behind it, a deeper concern about the true agenda of the current UK government, not only encapsulated in this bill, but in their trade agenda too. It's apparent from the likes of Liz Truss and the speech that she gave at the free market extremist lobby group, the Cato Institute, a couple of years back, complaining of the thicket of regulations and welcoming their race-to-the-bottom agenda on food, on safety, on public services, public health and on environmental protection. Liz Truss's attitude to these issues, she's far from alone in the UK government in sharing this agenda with a right-wing, anti-environment, anti-social, climate change denying outfit like the Cato Institute. They've just appointed Tony Abbott, for goodness sake, to the UK Board of Trade. Another example, someone who's worked with Nigel Lawson's dishonest climate denial lobby group, someone who's denied this basic science for years and called it a cult. The UK government is willing to bring people like that into government. The UK government is willing to break international law and render itself untrustworthy either with international partners or within the governments elsewhere in these islands. The UK government is willing to undermine human rights, willing to overturn devolution. I do agree with the STUC's comment, which I quoted to Mr Rowley, that if the UK government makes good on its threat to legislate, to pass this bill in defiance of a refusal to consent to it by this Parliament, it will make the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable, because this bill does one thing very clearly. It exposes the reality of the choice Scotland faces, and in the context of the current UK government, that choice is between direct rule and independence.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I now call Willie Rennie to the Liberal Democrats. 4 minutes to Mr Rennie, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This legislation emerged from a hurried white paper in the summer and has been blasted through Westminster at high speed. The bill exists to smooth a trade deal with the United States of America. It gives UK ministers the power to sweep away objections from devolved administrations on matters like food safety and environmental safety. I have been astonished to hear UK ministers say that the Northern Ireland Protocol was done in haste, so cannot be relied upon. Those very same ministers are rushing through this legislation at breakneck timetable and a strong-arm guillotine, and they don't even blush. I was very interested in the expert witnesses at the committee. Professor Dugan wrote in his submission that many trade systems that rely on mutual recognition also incorporate multiple safeguards into its application. There are none in this bill. Professor Keating has pointed out in his evidence most systems with internal markets would be federal, with each of the different administrations having a say. But this bill gives power to one Secretary of State. I would prefer joint ministerial committees to be up and running with a dispute resolution process to keep the internal market moving. With the frameworks agreed by all four administrations, then the detailed implementation can be left to the individual administrations, safe in the knowledge that the fundamentals of the internal market are protected. My colleague on the committee, Beatrice Wishart, asked about fire safety standards. She pointed out that Peter Drummond, from the Royal Incorporation of Architects, said that Scotland's most robust fire safety regulations could fall foul of the bill. If we wanted to change or toughen its existing standards, the bill would appear to come into force against it. Now, in response, the UK government said, we will continue to be able to set our own regulations. But as the expert witness, Professor Dugan, pointed out, Technically speaking, the UK government is correct, but only if we totally ignore the bill that we are talking about. So you would have thought that it would be a pretty high-ranking office holder of the Boris Johnson fan club to think that this is an honest piece of legislation. However, it does seem that we might have a number of those individuals in the chamber today. And that's before we get to the brazen admission that this bill will break international law. So much for the party of law and order. But yet the Scottish Conservatives still stand by this bill. This bill is unnecessary. It is rushed. It is ill-conceived. It will undermine the United Kingdom partnership, will put power in the hands of just one minister, and will break international law. This Parliament should reject this legislative consent motion, and the UK Government should withdraw the bill without delay.
Thank you very much. Open debate, 4-minute speeches. Make sure you press your request to speak button to speak. I call Keith Brown to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, President Officer. I will not vote for this Parliament to consent to the UK Government's Internal Market Bill, and I have a number of reasons for that position. The bill, first of all, by the UK Government's own admission, breaks international law. It may do so in a specific and limited way, but it is state-sponsored law-breaking, and as such it further chips away at trust and respect and represents a full-scale assault on devolution and the powers of this Parliament. Is it any wonder that the latest Scottish Social Attitude Survey released last week shows that just 15% of those asked trust the UK Government to work in Scotland's interests? And that, President Officer, was before it was revealed that the UK Government is specifically, deliberately and disgracefully keeping secret from the Scottish Government and this Parliament consideration of a number of crucial measures that will directly affect devolved competencies. The respect agenda indeed seems like a long time ago, and not a word of concern did we hear about that from the Tories in this chamber. The Internal Market Bill will lead, in my view, to a race to the bottom in regulations in areas such as health protection, animal welfare or housing and environmental standards. Now, in 1997, the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly, nearly 75%, in support of a Parliament for Scotland. A Parliament reconvened after 300 years that was tasked with setting priorities for Scotland. A Parliament that's allowed us to take a different path from the UK in so many issues, such as free prescriptions, no tuition fees for students, something lambasted by Tories in this chamber for years, but apparently they now support it, minimum pricing for alcohol and a fairer, more just social security system. Now, we know the Tories never fully got behind devolution, but those in this Parliament, as well as members from all other parties, have a duty to defend the devolution settlement and acknowledge the level of contempt that this bill shows the Scottish Parliament and the other devolved nations of the UK. It also demonstrates to me the Tories in this Parliament have no expectation, no serious expectation of ever exercising power in Scotland. If they did so, they wouldn't be so happy to cheer the removal of powers from this devolved Parliament. No, I won't. I don't have time. Instead, well, you never gave way to anybody either yourself. Instead, the Tories in this Parliament have fallen into line behind Boris. They now support Brexit, despite 62% of voters in Scotland opposing it. Just like it was revealed last week that they danced to London's tune when they were told by a Westminster MP to support scrapping the hate crime bill, putting political point scoring above engaging constructively to better the lives of the people of Scotland. As with other Brexit-related legislation, the UK Parliament has contemptuously passed laws that affect devolved matters, despite the consent of one or more of the devolved administrations being withheld. Now, I acknowledge, Presiding Officer, there is little hope of a different outcome on this issue, but what there is an opportunity for the Tories in this Parliament to stand up, find a spine and say enough is enough. The UK's 5 living former Prime Ministers, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron and Theresa May, have all spoken out against this bill. Will the Scottish Tories speak out against this bill? I think we know the answer to that. After years ignoring Scotland's interests and its clear democratic wishes, it should come as no surprise to the Tories that the number of Scots backing independence is now at record levels. Indeed, when the removal of powers from this Parliament was first proposed, the SNP, my party, put on 7,000 members virtually overnight. Such was the outrage at the proposal back over 2 years ago. And now the number of Scots backing independence is at record levels. And if the UK Government imposes this bill on Scotland, it will become ever more evident that the only way to protect Scotland's interests and our place in Europe is to become an independent country. This is, Presiding Officer, a huge moment in the constitutional development of this Parliament. And if this Parliament, by a large majority, refuses consent, and Boris Johnson and his acolytes in this Parliament ride roughshod over this Parliament, then the STUC, as they have said, and as Patrick Harvey's referred to, have said that the referendum on independence becomes unanswerable, and we will have that referendum.
Thank you. I now call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Annabel Yu. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. With all the hysterical language we've just been hearing about what this bill is about, I think we need to focus on what really matters here, and that is the importance of the UK internal market to Scottish business. And we know, according to the Fraser of Allender Institute, who I think might know a little bit more about this than the Ferret, over 500,000 jobs in Scotland are supported by demand for our goods and services from the rest of the UK. 60% of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the UK, worth over £50 billion a year to the Scottish economy. And we know that trade to the rest of the UK is worth 3 times as much as trade to the EU single market. And against that backdrop, it's no wonder there have been calls from those involved in business and trade for legislation to ensure that the UK internal market works seamlessly in a post-Brexit environment. The CBI have said preserving the integrity of the single market, the economic glue binding our 4 nations, is essential to guard against any additional costs or barriers to doing business between different parts of the UK. The Scottish Retail Consortium have said that Scotland benefits enormously from the UK internal market. The National Farmers Union of Scotland have said it is vital for the agricultural industry. Oil and Gas UK have said that regulatory barriers will harm their sector, and Quality Meat Scotland have said they want frictionless trade in the UK to be maintained as far as possible. So there is a clear demand for the legislation before us. And it's disappointing that in the contributions we hear from the other parties in this chamber, there seems to be little recognition for this, of the need for this legislation. Now, we've heard from Michael Russell that this bill represents a power grab from the UK government. But in reality, as we've heard, there are 111 powers coming to the Scottish Parliament as a result of Brexit, and only a single power currently being exercised that is being removed. And the hypocrisy of the SNP's position is while they complain about a power grab in this bill, they are pursuing their own power grab on Holyrood with the EU Continuity Bill, a bill which will hand extensive powers to Scottish ministers to introduce new laws in Scotland without detailed parliamentary scrutiny in order to keep pace with EU laws, laws made by a third party where we have had no say in their development. Under the SNP's plans, we will become a rule taker, but we will not be a rule maker. And it is little wonder we've had so much opposition from stakeholders to what they are proposing. And we should never forget, Presiding Officer, that in relation to all the powers the SNP are complaining about in this bill, they want to hand every single one of them straight back to the EU. So obsessed are they with EU membership, they would rather damage our businesses and the Scottish economy by aligning with the EU in preference to aligning with the UK, when that UK market is worth 3 times the Scottish business what the EU market is worth. And yet, for reasons of their narrow ideological obsession, they will damage the Scottish economy by threatening our ability to trade with the UK. And we should not accept for a moment either the nonsense that is being stated that this bill would lead to a lowering of standards. Already the UK, as Dean Lockhart said, has exceptionally high standards when it comes to the protection of consumers and workers, higher standards than the EU as a whole, whether it comes to animal welfare or the environment or workers' rights. We are far ahead of what the EU offers. That is the position we should be maintaining, and there is nothing in this bill that threatens that. Presiding Officer, this bill also contains the right for UK ministers to spend money directly in Scotland, a measure we should all welcome. With Brexit, we will no longer have EU structure funds, and the UK government has agreed that these will be replaced with direct UK investment in Scotland in exactly the same way as we have seen from the EU in the past. And yet, strangely, SNP politicians seem to object to this extra money, to extra resources coming for their constituents, for infrastructure projects, for cultural projects, for community initiatives. They're happy to accept this money when it comes from the EU, but they're so blinkered and prejudiced against the UK. They would rather turn this money down rather than have it from a UK shared resource rather from the EU. Presiding Officer, this UK internal market is essential to Scottish business, and for that reason we should back it and reject this nonsense motion.
I call Annabel Ewing, please, to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we have heard, the UK's bill would impose a series of rules on trade within the UK following the end of the transition period with the EU. on 31st December and a likely cliff-edge Brexit, a situation, of course, that we in Scotland did not vote for. But as of course, on Brexit, just as on everything else, our views are ignored and our votes simply disregarded by the UK. And I don't know why the Tory frontbenchers are smirking. The rules to be imposed by the UK government would mean, for example, that state aid powers concerning devolved areas would be taken away to London, that London would take control of key devolved spending powers, and that there would be inevitably a race to the bottom in terms of, for example, food and environmental standards. Indeed, it is quite clear that public policy protections in the bill have been drawn very narrowly and are very limited in scope, and they would not be sufficient to keep out of Scotland cheap imported chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef. As Professor Catherine Barnard said in evidence to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee on 24 September, and I quote, "The mutual recognition principle will drive a coach and horses through any attempts by the Scottish Government to reflect local preferences for not having chlorinated chicken." And Professor Michael Dugan of the University of Liverpool said at the same meeting, and I quote, "It means that the market forces that are unleashed by the principle of mutual recognition will not be operating in a neutral manner among England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The sheer market size of England means that market forces will lead English standards to be prevalent." There we have it, Presiding Officer. An internal market of Jonah and the whale, with none of the protections we currently benefit from as being part of the EU single market of 500 million people. Presiding Officer, the UK Tory government ask us to trust them, not to change the status quo, and to trust them to consult with us, even though there is no requirement in the bill to do so. This is the same UK Tory government which has such regard for our Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament that it scrapped the UK budget statement by Twitter. The same UK Tory government that hid important information about possible food shortages and its state aid power grab from the Scottish Government. The same UK Tory government that proposes to break international law and renege on commitments given under treaty to our international partners. Presiding Officer, this bill represents an unprecedented attack on devolution. The people of Scotland joined together to ensure that we saw our Scottish Parliament reconvened in 1999, and no UK Tory government is going to rewrite our history. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would say to the Tories that we see you, the people of Scotland see you, for there is no respect agenda in this union. There is no trust in this union, and we are certainly not feeling much love anymore, Presiding Officer. Rather, there is an increasingly hostile environment for Scotland in the union. As the STUC has said about the bill, and I would quote, "Should the UK government proceed with the bill against the wishes of the Scottish Parliament, it makes the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable." I entirely agree with that statement, Presiding Officer, and would conclude by saying that it is only with independence that we can take our own decisions and determine our own future. Surely that is the better path for Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. James Kelly, followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to speak in favour of the Government's motion opposing the LCM and also rejecting the Conservative amendment. I think there are two central issues that need to be addressed in terms of assessing the UK Internal Market Bill. It's the allocation of powers and the settlement of disputes. In relation to powers, once the Brexit process is complete, clearly the powers will run from the EU to the UK, and any logical observer would have then accepted that a consensual approach and consensual discussion should have been entered into to ensure that the powers were divided up appropriately, with those powers that are consistent with the devolution settlement coming straight to Scotland. But what the Tories have done with this legislation is to put aside the common frameworks which have been used and have been worked on as a negotiation, and to effectively reject the intergovernment process and to seek to impose their view by the introduction of this legislation. And it's for that reason that the LCM needs to be rejected. I mean, on a couple of examples, the Conservatives argue that this is about protection of the economy and protection of jobs, but the acceptance of this legislation would mean that state aid powers would be held at Westminster. Surely we would want the state aid powers here in Scotland, particularly at a time when we're going to have to address the economic impact of the pandemic. In addition to that, the setting up of the Office of the Internal Market would allow the UK Government the basis to impose rules and regulations on other parts of the United Kingdom. That's simply unfair, and it doesn't work as a fair process. I think the other point is that this legislation doesn't offer an effective disputes process. Clearly, when powers have been discussed, there will be disputes, and there needs to be an arbitration process. There can't be a veto from either the UK Government or the Scottish Government. There needs to be a process that's worked with all four devolved nations to ensure that there can be a consensual approach. And that's going to be part of the solution. In terms of those who have sought to bring the independence referendum into this, I don't think in the midst of a pandemic and all the public health issues and the jobs that are potentially going to be lost, that would not be the right time for an independence referendum. And therefore, I think the Conservatives need to reflect very carefully on their actions. We heard Douglas Ross the other day saying that he felt that some of his colleagues in England didn't understand Scotland and didn't understand the strength of the issues that were at stake. Well, if the Conservatives at the close of decision time tonight press their buttons and support this legislation and try and support the LCM, that in effect is helping to feed the fuels of the fire of those in this debate who have argued for a second independence referendum. And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, it's important that we protect the devolution process. We oppose this LCM and we don't let the Tories trash devolution.
Thank you very much. I now call Kenneth Gibson, followed by Liz Smith. Mr Gibson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In this Parliament, members have worked hard for 2 decades deliberating and legislating on devolved matters, naturally leading to significant policy divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK. What the UK Internal Market Bill makes clear is that UK Tory ministers are no longer prepared to accept divergence as an integral part of devolution, which this bill seeks to rein in, treating policy differences between administrations as a spurious barrier to trade, a problem to be solved. Of course, as we leave the EU, there is a need for coordination and collaboration between governments and parliaments across these islands. We must work with colleagues across the UK to create a system which minimises trade barriers and respects the authority and legitimacy of each Parliament Assembly. This is not the bill's aim. There is no provision whatsoever to involve devolved administrations in any meaningful way in the development and governance of the UK's internal market. The bill states that the Secretary of State must, and I quote, consult the Scottish ministers, the Welsh ministers and the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. It's not clear how this consultation process will work in practice, but ultimately the bill ensures that Westminster will oversee evolution of the UK's internal market. Any measures deemed to impact the internal market will have to be approved by UK ministers, and any significant policy changes by this Parliament will then have to be given the green light by Westminster. This bill represents a rolling back of devolution's core principle that this Parliament has competence to legislate on all devolved matters. If we take the example of minimum unit pricing, if revised, we would be able to enforce it only for Scottish products. Due to mutual recognition and non-discrimination, we could not act against cheap English alcohol imports. On paper, we'll still have legislative powers. In practice, what would be the point? People would simply buy cheaper imported alcohol, disadvantaging Scottish producers and failing to achieve the public interest objective of minimum unit pricing. All 4 UK nations will have to accept goods at the standards set in one country, making it difficult to envisage any scenario that doesn't result in a race to the bottom. This will be particularly worrying when coupled with reports of low regulation trade deals where Scotland normally competes on quality. If forced to accept cheap, low-quality products in the name of market integrity, it will have a hugely negative impact on Scottish agriculture. When governments work together, compromise is required to balance needs and interests. The UK Government makes no compromise with this bill or any attempt to create a sense of confidence and mutual trust amongst all partners. There has been no attempt to even create the illusion that legislation is being adapted to consider the devolved administrations. By the UK Government's own admission, this bill also breaks international law and allows UK ministers to prevent the application of and unilaterally reinterpret and disapply parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, despite legal obligations to enact the protocol under both international and domestic UK law. The international response is rightly hostile. The EU has launched a legal action against the UK for failing to meet its withdrawal agreement obligations. The bill also risks future trade deals. Speaker of America's House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi declared there is absolutely no chance of a UK-US trade deal passing through Congress if the UK violates an international treaty and undermines the Good Friday Agreement. The bill's scope and ambiguity is deeply worrying. At the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, Professor Michael Keaton said he, and I quote, "cannot see why we should give all these powers to UK ministers when we don't know how they will be used." Presiding Officer, giving consent to this bill would place power and trust in the hands of UK ministers to act in good faith and in the best interests of the people of Scotland. It's utterly laughable. The bill by its very nature is an example of the Tory government's proclivity for acting in bad faith. They are prepared to break international law, renege on the Good Friday Agreement and undermine devolution. This Parliament has a responsibility to protect Scotland's interests. We must not grant legislative consent to this bill.
Thank you very much. I call Liz Smith to be followed by John Mason. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you. In August, when this chamber last debated the UK Internal Market Bill, all the political parties in the chamber agreed that when we leave the transition period at the end of this year, thereby losing the checks which the EU internal market previously brought to domestic law, the exercise of devolved competence could, for the first time, threaten the integrity of the UK internal market. Now, my colleague Adam Tompkins said that day, and it was a speech that was much complimented by Mike Russell, that any interruption to the UK internal market would not only be contrary to the UK's interests, but contrary to the interests of Scottish consumers, producers, manufacturers and distributors, including the protection of 500,000 Scottish jobs, which is obviously absolutely vital at this time of COVID. Adam Tompkins was right. And that is precisely why we need a UK internal market bill. Because let us not forget, as Murdo Fraser quite rightly pointed out, that Scotland trades 1.5 times as much with the rest of the UK as it does with the whole of the EU and the rest of the world put together. It is worth nearly 4 times as much to Scots as the EU's single market is. So that is why there was general agreement back in August across all the political parties in this chamber that it is not in anyone's interests, whether you're a unionist or a nationalist, to erect new barriers to trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK in a minute. And the presiding officer, I think, will accept an intervention, yes?
Member to accept the intervention, not myself. Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. Surely Liz Smith accepts that it's not only the interests of those commercial operators, those businesses that should be taken into account, but the wider public interest in terms of health, social, public services, safety and so on, and that it's for this Parliament to decide whether divergence is politically acceptable in the context of specific
Mr.
examples.
Harvey, bearing in mind we've not got a lot of time.
Thank you for that intervention, and you're quite right. It's not just about economic interests, it's about other things. I'll come to that in just a minute. And my colleagues have spoken about the views of stakeholders in this, whether it's the CBI or the Scottish Retail Consortium, the NFUS, whether it's the oil and gas sectors, food industries. They have all been absolutely plain in their support for securing that economic stability and protecting jobs. But that is not, now I won't if you don't mind, but that does not deal with the other key issue, which is to ensure that enough is being done, and perhaps this answers Mr. Harvey's point, to protect the need for legitimate policy differences with the devolved nations and the effective working of the doctrine of proportionality, which allows for that necessary divergence. And of course, that second point is all about protecting and indeed enhancing the devolution settlement, because it would not be satisfactory if that right to legitimate policy divergence was undermined. For example, we know that the SNP has been concerned about that the manner of sale or pricing regulations could be undermined for issues like plastic bags or minimum unit alcohol. And it was true that there wasn't enough clarity about that on that issue, which is why on the 29th of September, the UK government put in place technical amendments to ensure that all parts of the UK have the freedom to regulate for pricing and manner of sale policies and to ensure that that is beyond doubts when it comes to the courts. Now, I am well aware that the SNP doesn't agree with this, although if you look back at the speeches that were made when we debated in August, there was, and also I think Mr Russell's letter in 2018, there was an acceptance that the common frameworks on their own are not enough, because they are not legally binding, and there is a need to ensure that there is that legal binding nature. And I think Mr Russell might have changed his mind just a little bit on that in the intervening 2 years. So I'll finish on that point, Deputy Presiding Officer. This bill is needed to protect the economy and to protect the social interests of Scotland, and that is why I will obviously be supporting the amendment in the name of Dean Lockhart.
Thank you very much, Ms Smith. And I call John Mason, to be followed by Tom Arthur. Mr Arthur is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I have to say that I am far from convinced that this bill is necessary at all. Of course, businesses want to sell their products throughout the UK, and there is no evidence that I'm aware of that this is under threat. We have effectively had an internal market with England for 313 years. That is much longer than we have been in the EU. So we have to assume that there is an ulterior motive for the UK government to bring this bill forward. The key issue for me is whether we are proceeding in this by... No, that you took none, I'm taking none. The key issue for me is whether we are proceeding in this by negotiation, compromise and common frameworks, or whether it is to be an imposition from Westminster. If this bill passes, it further strengthens the hand of London over the 3 devolved legislators. At the very least, it means that negotiations and common frameworks would become increasingly one-sided, as we would be negotiating with a gun to our heads, and any failure to agree would lead to the fallback position of the UK government making all the decisions. And even if there was a less formal common framework agreed on a particular topic, any organisation going to court against the Scottish Government, as the Scottish Whisky Association did previously, could appeal to this bill as overriding the common frameworks. That is why I oppose the bill from a constitutional point of view and would urge members not to give consent to it. However, there are a number of practical reasons too. We received evidence from the General Teaching Council for Scotland of their concerns about teachers' qualifications. Scotland has long had its own requirements to approve teachers, and England has had different ones. No one is saying one is right and the other is wrong, but they are just different for different situations. This bill, as it stands, would mean that we have to recognise professional qualifications from other parts of the UK. So that could mean that any teacher from elsewhere in the UK could challenge our setting different requirements. So I asked Michael Gove about this when he appeared at committee. Firstly, he ignored the question and answered a different one. He said that there would be no interference in Scottish education. However, that was not the question. What I had asked was whether Scotland could be forced to accept any teacher from the rest of the UK. He did not answer that. Similarly, with other subjects like minimum pricing for alcohol, witnesses raised concerns that although the present scheme could probably stay in place, if we tried to raise the minimum unit price significantly, even for health reasons, this could be challenged, and there would be less legal protection than the EU gave. Michael Gove sought to reassure the committee that the present government at Westminster, and he himself in particular, had no intention of going down that route. But the reality is that if these powers are in legislation, he himself may be a very nice man and completely trustworthy, but that does not mean that future ministers in future UK governments will be either as nice or as trustworthy. And of course, it is not just the UK government's intentions which matter here. With minimum unit pricing for alcohol, it was the whisky industry that went to court. So once this law is in place, any business or organisation can use it against Scotland. Presiding Officer, we want free trade with the UK. We have free trade with the UK. And of course the UK is our largest market, and we want to maintain that. However, this Parliament was set up for a reason. That reason was that the centralised UK state, with all decisions made in London, was not working. If it is the Conservatives' intention to reverse the devolution process, they have the power to do that. However, I would warn them that it will come back to haunt them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll call Tom Arthur, then closing speeches. Mr Arthur, please.
Presiding Officer, the Internal Market Bill may prove to be the death knell of devolution. It provides a means for UK ministers to employ direct power to intervene in devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, and it allows for the use of indirect power to undermine the laws of this Parliament. An example of direct power can be found in Part 6 of the Bill, which would allow UK ministers to bypass this Parliament to spend in devolved areas such as health, education, justice, housing, transport, culture and sport. Presiding Officer, it is the role of this Parliament and local authorities to decide spending in devolved areas. If Part 6 is intended as a vehicle to deliver a replacement to EU structural funds, it falls short of what is required and should be amended or removed. A better model would be for any replacement funds to be included within the block grant. That would maximise democratic oversight and allow all the members of this Parliament to play a role in shaping how these funds should be utilised. What we have in the bill, however, is an arbitrary system where funding could be decided on the whim of a UK minister or even solely for perceived political gain. That would be a recipe for confusion and contradiction in public spending. I also fear it would be the thin end of the wedge. I don't say that lightly. I am not one for engaging in conspiracy theories or scare stories, but is it unreasonable to suspect that it is the worst of motives that underlies so much of what this UK government seeks to do? A government led by a man who orchestrated the unlawful proroguing of Parliament, a government that introduces the very bill that we are debating, which by their own admission would breach international law, a government that was revealed only yesterday is deliberately withholding important information on Brexit from the devolved administrations. Could we, for example, have confidence that this UK government would not reduce the Scottish Parliament's budget in future years before seeking to position itself through these direct funding powers as a generous benefactor ready to step in and help, subject to certain conditions, of course? Would funding for healthcare be conditional on the marketisation of our NHS, as in England? Would support for transport infrastructure be in the form of loans to be financed through tolls, as many roads in England are subject to? Would money be used to undermine lefty activist lawyers and do-gooders? Regardless of whatever the UK government has in mind, it is unacceptable for the simple reason that it is for this Parliament to make decisions on devolved spending. Presiding Officer, I will briefly turn now to how the internal market seeks to indirectly undermine the lawmaking powers of this Parliament. Parts 1 and 2 of the bill introduce and apply the market access principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination to goods and services. The effect of this measure is that goods or services originating in one part of the UK must be accepted in all parts of the UK, irrespective of differences in regulatory standards. This potentially would allow one part of the UK to gain a competitive advantage through deregulation. Given the size of its population, economy and political power relative to other parts of the UK, English regulations would ultimately have to be acquiesced to by the other nations. Across a range of areas, it would reduce this place to a puppet parliament with London pulling the strings. Presiding Officer, this bill is a power grab and it tells us much about the nature of the UK and its government. To quote one of the great writers in power, Robert Carroll, although the cliché says that power always corrupts, what is seldom said is that power always reveals. When a man is climbing, trying to persuade others to give him power, concealment is necessary. But as a man obtains more power, camouflage becomes less necessary. Presiding Officer, the mask has slipped. There is no partnership of equals, and this certainly does not feel like a family of nations. The UK government is seeking to use raw power to roll back devolution. We must not allow this to happen. Conclude. All MSPs worthy of their position will join with the Scottish Government at decision time in defending the dignity and rights of our Parliament
No, you can't go on. I was hard on everybody else, sorry. I call on Claudia Beamish to close for Labour, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Throughout the divisive and disempowering Brexit process, Scottish Labour has taken a very keen interest in developments about which we have become increasingly alarmed. This particularly, though not exclusively by any means, relates to the development of the post-EU arrangements for trade and for our precious environment and the grave threat to devolution. When I last spoke in this chamber on the internal market, it was at the stage of the UK Tory government white paper. At that point, I and others emphasised the grave concerns we had about this direction in relation to Scotland's and indeed the UK as a whole's interest. When I was speaking on the 17th of August in the debate, I expressed incredulity at the lack of respect for the devolved settlement by the UK Tory government. At that time, I stated that the white paper proposals were beholden to capital and had no loyalty to place, collaboration or subsidiarity, and risked undermining any partnership between local, community-owned local businesses and trade unions. How naive of me to hope against hope that in the UK Tory government there could be someone listening to the concerns about threatening the very devolution settlement itself. How falsely optimistic of me to envisage that someone in the UK Tory government might wake up and realise how seriously wrong they had got it. The Finance and Constitution Committee was indeed correct to call for a much longer, transparent and inclusive debate on the proposals in the White Paper. The wider debate included blunt comments from ex-Prime Minister John Major, and I quote, "This has wide-ranging ramifications. It will not only make negotiations with the EU more difficult, but also any trade negotiations with other nations, including the United States. Once trust is undermined, distrust becomes prevalent." However, no one in the UK Tory government was listening to him, and they certainly weren't listening to us in our Scottish Parliament. Now we have a draft bill, UK bill to consider, and the only option is to say a clear and resounding no. 20 years ago this Sunday, Donald Dewar, our first Minister, passed away. The determination of him and so many others from political parties and civic society to have a Scottish Parliament must not be threatened and undermined by this bill or anything else, and I acknowledge the Cabinet Secretary's recognition of his part. Here in Scotland, much of the law and certainty of our policies on environment, food standards, health, and more is established here in this Parliament and has been helped in its shaping by the EU laws and directives. We will not be forced in a race to the bottom here in Scotland. The STUC's concerns mainly relate to state aid, market access commitment, and intergovernmental arrangements. Their briefing highlights that the Internal Market Bill reserves state aid to Westminster, despite this not being reserved in the Scotland Act. And it states, I will quote briefly in terms of time, that we have here in Scotland the ability to effect financial support to workplaces threatened with closure, to take state utilities back into public ownership, and much more. So this starkly highlights the totally unacceptable arrangements that this bill would lead to. As we struggle with COVID, as Alex Rowley stressed, with such economic uncertainty, it is further devolution that is required to build back a better Scotland. And James Kelly stressed the lack of a dispute resolution arrangement in the bill. The lack of respect by the UK government for our devolved arrangements and the need for mutual respect on forging the way forward is an ominous signal of a determination to centralise that will be resisted robustly. The upcoming continuity bill will pin down some of our way forward, and I look forward to the stage 1 debate after recess. Further, the UK bill is not about seamless trade as stated in the purpose of the bill. The common frameworks would do that in a way that is apparent if the UK government had acted with more alacrity on this, and it is still possible to shape these frameworks. It is not too late to have future arrangements through agreement. I now want to turn finally to the concerns raised in relation to the Irish peace process by this bill. John Major and Tony Blair wrote in the Sunday Times last month, I quote, "It puts the Good Friday Agreement at risk because it negates predictability, political stability and legal clarity that are integral to the delicate balance between the North and the South of Ireland that is at the core of the peace process. The threat to the peace process and the lack of respect for international law are reasons alone to vote down the LCM. There are sadly many more reasons outlined by members across most of the chamber today, and thus Scottish Labour rejects the Tory amendment, and it also makes it quite clear, as we have through Alex Rowley and James Kelly and myself, that Scottish Labour supports the Scottish Government motion. We will not support an LCM for this very disrespectful and dangerous bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Maurice Golden to close to the Conservatives. Mr Golden, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It is important not to lose sight of the most important aspect of this debate, how to protect Scottish jobs, businesses and the economy, a point made expertly by my colleague Murdo Fraser. Regardless of members' views on the Constitution, it is an indisputable fact that Scotland's economy is intertwined with the rest of the United Kingdom. As such, there is a responsibility on every MSP to ensure the continued success of the UK internal market. There are simply too many Scottish jobs at stake, over 500,000 in fact, as my colleague Dean Lockhart pointed out. We heard from Alec Rowley, who gets more cheers from the SNP benches than he does the Labour ones these days. He claims the bill breaks international law. Untrue, incorrect and ill-informed as ever. A point made further by a number of SNP members, as well as, of course, Patrick Harvey, who claimed members, including myself, opposed the Scottish Parliament. I did not. I would have supported it if I were old enough to vote, Mr Harvey. And with almost two-thirds of all the Scottish trade conducted with the rest of the UK, businesses need certainty that commerce will carry on as usual across the United Kingdom now we have left the EU. The UK Internal Market Bill provides that certainty, that products made in one part of the United Kingdom will not face additional barriers to market in another part of the UK, and that consumers in one part of the UK are not disadvantaged by limiting access to goods and services. Not only is that plain common sense, it is what we have done for centuries. The UK Internal Market Bill brings the process into the 21st century to work with devolution. As long as they do not discriminate against goods and services from elsewhere in the UK, devolved governments will be able to set their own rules and standards, which are then recognised across the entire UK. The SNP had to take the EU to court to get their alcohol minimum pricing scheme through. Under the UK Internal Market Bill, they could introduce that scheme without court action. Liz Smith eloquently articulated how the doctrine of proportionality would allow divergence and enhance devolution. I'll give way to Patrick Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
I recognise the extent to which the member is making real efforts to do the mental gymnastics necessary to justify this bill. He's making a good effort at it. But does he at least acknowledge the substantial amount of evidence that didn't come from politicians, didn't come from pro-independence activists, came from independent witnesses telling us that this bill will leave more uncertainty and will leave major decisions in the hands not of democratic parliaments here or at Westminster, but in the hands of the courts. Exactly the same kind of uncertainty he wants to oppose is written into this bill.
Maurice Golden.
No. I won't be taking any lessons from Patrick Harvey, who has a modus operandi to destroy devolution. That's what he wants. I'm here standing up for devolution. And that's why we require cooperation across business groups, such as what the CBI have been calling for. And the Conservatives stand ready to work with the Scottish Government on this bill. I would urge the SNP to at least keep their minds open to cooperation, even if their natural instinct is not to. And I'll come to that in a moment. For example, it would have been welcome today to hear the SNP discuss how best to use the new powers from the UK Internal Market Bill to take. Of course, they laugh because they want to give those powers to unelected officials in Brussels and send them away from the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Conservatives are keen to have that discussion and ensure those powers are used for the best of the people of Scotland. That is why it's so disappointing today to see another ill-tempered debate with nationalist politicians more interested in senseless UK bashing than properly considering this legislation. They take every opportunity to undermine and oppose the UK, even when that risks thousands of Scottish jobs. Why else would the
Just a minute, sorry. Mr Arthur, you're shouting to people in the gallery and you're softly spoken, Mr Golden, so I'd like to hear what Mr Golden has to say. Please continue.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I go back to my earlier point. Why on earth would the Cabinet Secretary walk out of talks on the UK internal market? The Cabinet Secretary claims he felt the talks would have led to a proposal that threatens devolution. But are we really supposed to believe a man who actively campaigns to end devolution, as Patrick Harvey does, is suddenly concerned with preserving it? That same ideological opposition to the UK sees the Cabinet Secretary accept the need for common frameworks covering specific sectors, whilst refusing to take the next logical step of providing a regulatory baseline to fill the gaps between those frameworks, as the bill aims to do. The SNP must accept that ignorant anti-UK sentiment will not help Scottish jobs and businesses. A more modern and progressive approach would be engaging constructively with the UK Government on all legislation and other measures being undertaken to safeguard and protect Scottish jobs and livelihoods.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. I call on Michael Russell to close to the Scottish Government. Mr Russell, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. Can I make 3 introductory points which are factually based so that Mr Golding can have those facts on the record? 1, there is no threat from any of the devolved administrations or governments or parliaments to the continuation of seamless, unfettered trade within the UK. There is no such threat. No Tory has been able to point to such a threat. There is no intention of such a threat. So let's make that clear. Secondly, you do not have to be in the same constitutional structure to trade with your largest customer. If you did, the UK would not be leaving the EU. That is simply reality. And thirdly, this bill is illegal. It contains breaches of international law. It would therefore be against the ministerial code for any minister in this chamber to support this bill. Now, I have to say that no thank you, no thank you. I have the sound of your voice in my ears enough this afternoon. I couldn't take any more of it. I'm sorry. Even I have a limit to that sort of suffering. I have to say to you that I have a lot of time for some Conservative members. Not many, I have to say. And I'm going to again embarrass Liz Smith because I have a lot of time for Liz Smith. She was my shadow when I was Education Secretary. She regularly called for my resignation, but I got over it, I have to say. And therefore I want to reflect on something that she said about the change over the last few years. Now, she said it, unfortunately, I thought, in a somewhat dismissive way, as if I had changed my mind and vacillated on these matters. But actually, I just want to go back to 4 years ago, and it's useful that Ruth Davidson is sitting behind her, because she herself, on the day after the 23rd of June, a period after, was very clear that what Scotland should be seeking is the closest possible relationship with the EU, and indeed continued membership of the single market and the customs union. Those were the things that united most of these chambers after the 23rd of June. And isn't it extraordinary that just over 4 years on, what we've actually experienced this afternoon, Tory members mouthing off about us handing powers to Brussels, attacking alignments on standards, bad-mouthing Europe, essentially painting Europe as the devil incarnate, because that's what we've heard and that's what we hear again and again. Also, a huge attack on devolution, an attack on the powers of this Parliament, not about making sure that Scotland could continue to be in the single market and the customs union, but in actual fact that our powers should be diminished. And consider, no, thank you, no. If there's one thing worse than Mr Golding's voice, it was yours. I have to say no, absolutely not. Huge attack on devolution, huge attack of, well, yes.
Cabinet,
I can't.
Sorry, Ms Smith, just sit down a wee minute. Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure you can do better than that, than to use personal insults. Ms Smith.
Presiding Officer,
Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, you're taking an intervention, I take from Ms Smith.
I was.
Yeah, well, that's it now then.
I apologise to you, but if you...
No, it's not a discussion.
Fine.
Ms Smith, please.
I won't waste the opportunity. Could I just ask the Cabinet Secretary once again, can he name one single power that is going to be removed from this Parliament?
I can indeed. I can
Cabinet Secretary.
The powers of devolution will be removed because that is a single or collective power, and Well, I want to come on in a moment, Presiding Officer, to the laughter on the Tory benches, which was deeply unpleasant at times this afternoon and is unpleasant again now. Because the reality is every power this Parliament has can be second-guessed as a result of this bill. There is no doubt about that. But there's been a huge attack on devolution, and the Tories have been isolated this afternoon as extreme Brexiteers. All of them have been isolated as extreme Brexiteers who not only admit the breach of international law, but revel in the breach of international law. And the saddest thing of all of this is the refusal to listen to any and all opinion that has been expressed on this matter. Mr Lockhart heard from the committee before he spoke, which made it clear, that, and I think Bruce Crawford's final words were, that devolution cannot work if the UK government imposes its view on the devolved nations. He made that clear. They heard from Labour, Alec Rowley saying, think again. They heard from Patrick Harvey, who talked about the decision-making of the UK government. They heard from the Lib Dems, and I rarely, if ever, can actually not criticise a word of Willie Rennie's speech. I enjoy criticising words of Willie Rennie's speeches, and on this occasion I can't, which will put him in deep trouble with Mr Rumbles, but he has my approbation for actually doing that. Then we heard from the Royal Incorporation of Architects of Scotland, the GTC, the NFUS, the SCDI, all dismissed. And indeed, the NFUS, in a very sinister move, were misquoted on what they said. Because they were clear, they were very clear in the submission on the white paper what they felt. But that was brushed aside. Because the reality is that, in the words of an Irving Berlin song, they're all out of step but Jim. They're all out of step except what the Tories believe to be true, and not even they believe it. Because there are people on the Tory benches who know this is deeply wrong. This is deeply wrong. Because this goes well beyond what should be happening. And we heard that in the rather nervous laughter on the Tory benches during the opening speeches. They were giggling like school children when they'd heard a naughty word. But I couldn't actually work out what the naughty word was. Was the naughty word Scotland? Was the naughty word democracy? Or was the naughty word devolution? Because on each of those occasions, they were giggling away at those words. I want to conclude, Presiding Officer, by making something very clear. There is no doubt whatsoever, from the evidence that the committees have heard, there's no doubt from the bill itself, this is a major attack on devolution. It is illegal, and if it is supported today by the Tories, they are aiding and abetting a hostile Westminster government in undermining this Parliament. There are no ifs, there are no buts on this. They are also voting for something that is against international law, and they will know it. And this afternoon, there were 3 solicitors who sat on the Tory benches, who sat through this, and not one of them referred to the legal issues in this bill. That is shocking. I go back those 4 years, because 4 years ago, just after the Brexit referendum, there was a view in this chamber that we could find a way forward for Scotland that preserved something of the valuable things we have from the EU. And now we have a host of ranting Brexiteers who are about, Mr Simpson laughs, a host of ranting Brexiteers who are unfortunately undermining this Parliament and the democracy of Scotland. It will not stand. It will not stand. Tom Arthur made that point, and I make it again. This is wrong. It should not happen. We should refuse permission, and we should continue to oppose this, no matter what.
Thank you very much. And I believe you're about to apologise to me if I interrupted you, so thank you very much. I accept it. Do you want to say it now? Can I thank you for anticipating the terms of it, which you didn't hear, but you know me so well. Unfortunately, yes. Now, that concludes the debate on legislative consent to the Internal Market Bill, and it's time to move on to the next item of business, and there'll be a short pause.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Our next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 22964 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on the Minister to move this motion? Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak to the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 22964 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of 8 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Again, could I call on Mr Day on behalf of the Bureau to move motions 22965 on committee meeting times, 22966 and 22967 on designation of lead committee, and 22968, 22969, 22971 to 22973 on approval of SSIs. Thank you very much. Those questions will be put at decision time. And we come to decision time now. The first question is that Amendment 22955.1 in the name of Dean Lockhart, which seeks to amend motion 22955 in the name of Michael Russell on legislative consent to the Internal Market Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We're going to move to a vote and we're just going to have a short suspension to allow members both in the chamber and online to access the voting app. There'll be a short suspension. Thank you, colleagues. We're just waiting for broadcasting to restart. We're about to restart in a few minutes, a few seconds actually. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let's get a big thumbs up there.
Did you get a thumbs up?
From broadcasting there.
Oh, we are, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. We are now broadcasting again and Parliament is resumed. So we're moving straight to the question. The question is that Amendment 22955.1 in the name of Dean Lockhart, which seeks to amend motion 22955 in the name of Mike Russell on legislative consent to the Internal Market Bill be agreed, and members be cast their votes now. Can I just confirm to any member online, if they think they have not registered their vote, could they please raise a point of order? Any member online who doesn't think that they have registered their vote, please raise a point of order. Can I call Fergus Ewing, please?
I would have voted no, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Ewing. That is noted. I will instruct the clerks to make sure your vote is added to the register before we call the result of the vote. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience, colleagues. The result of the vote on amendment number 22955.1 in the name of Dean Lockhart is yes 28, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 22955 in the name of Michael Russell as amended. Sorry, not as amended. It's unamended. It is unamended. It is the motion. It is the motion in the name of Michael Russell on legislative consent to the Internal Market Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. Members may vote now on the motion in the name of Michael Russell. Can I call Margaret Mitchell to make a point of order? Margaret Mitchell.
I wasn't able to vote, Presiding Officer. I would have voted no.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. That is noted. I will instruct the clerks to make sure your vote is added to the voter roll. Thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues. The result of the vote on motion 22955 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 90, no 28. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. Now I propose to ask a single question on 8 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does any member object? That's good. The question is that motions 22965 to 22969 and 22971 to 22973 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business. Can I encourage members just to be very careful leaving the chamber, to observe social distancing, and in particular outside in the one-way system in the corridors. There'll be a short pause before we move on to members' business in the name of Brian Whittle. Just a short pause.